Welcome everybody, and thanks for your patience. We know that traffic can be a real pain here in the Bay Area. My name is Ginny. I'm a librarian here at South San Francisco Public Library, and this is the third in our series with Dana Lombardi, and thank you so much for being here. We've got coffee and cookies, and please don't forget to fill out a survey before you leave because it really helps us plan more programs like this. So without further ado, welcome Dana Lombardi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I promise to make this entertaining, and I've even got presents for everybody. Okay, so make it worth your while. My name is Dana Lombardi. I'm with an organization called the World War I Historical Association, and we study the First World War, its impact on the world, and also we have an educational branch where this is part of it, where we go out and talk to people and explain why World War I was important, why it still affects us today. And this particular talk today is all about the air war, which this is the first time that aviation played a major role in military operations. And you'll see the competition, you'll see how they tried to develop new technology, new tactics, and all these things. Remember, none of this had ever been done before. It was unprecedented. So the fact that these airplanes were introduced was not the only thing they needed to do. They needed to figure out, well, how do we use them? And what can we do with them? And the interesting thing about World War I is that we know today there are drones, we know that there are strategic bombers, we know there are missiles, all those things. Did you know, though, that in World War I, except for missiles from ground to air or ground to ground, all those other things, including drones, were tested in World War I, even though they had very primitive, by our standards, airplanes. So I'm going to show you some of these things, and then whenever you feel you have a question or are going too fast, just wave your hand, I'll stop and can answer whatever questions you might have. No, that's not a World War I airplane, okay? That is the latest airplane in our U.S. Air Force inventory. It's the F-22 Raptor. And it's just amazing. But what we're going to talk about specifically today is what a lot of people know about airplanes are the fighters, the ones that are supposed to knock down other airplanes, knock down drones. This is how you control the air, is by having very, very sophisticated aircraft that are able to take control of the airspace over the battlefield. Why is that important? Why is air superiority important? It's because if you control the air, it means your reconnaissance drones, it means your reconnaissance aircraft can go over the battlefield, take pictures, and you can see what the enemy is doing, where they're building up forces, and literally get real-time information that helps you win a battle. It also means that you can send in bombing units, you can do all kinds of things if you have air superiority. So everyone that has an air force wants to try and do that. They want to gain air superiority over a battlefield, and it all started in World War I. That was what they started with. It looks really primitive, okay? That's the Morane L, but you'll notice that it has a German cross on the back end. That's because they were able to capture this airplane, and because they had so few of these. There's only about 150 airplanes that the Germans had, and about the same number that the British and French had at the beginning of World War I. It's not very many, but remember, it had never been used before. If you wanted to go out and find out who's out there, where the enemy is, you had to send out cavalrymen on horses who would ride down a road, take a look, and then ride back and try and tell somebody what they saw, because this is before radios. World War I was the first time you had a lot of radios, but even then, they didn't really connect well. They were primitive. They tried to use telephones, but then you need the cord with the telephone, and it doesn't work as well. So when you're up in the air, think about this. They did not have a lot of asphalt-type roads. It was usually dirt, okay, and it's the middle of summer, so what happens when thousands of men walk down or march down a road, or horses pull wagons or anything else? What goes into the sky? Dust. Tons and tons of dust. So even when you're up in the sky, and you look out 20 or 30 miles, if you see a lot of dust, what does that tell you? The enemy's over there. So you can go back and say, you know, my map, it sounds like a whole bunch of people, which direction they're going, what they've got. I can fly over the top of them. I can be so high that they can't shoot me. They may not even know that I'm there. So the most important single thing that aircraft did at the beginning of the war was simply observation. They just wanted to see where the enemy was, go back and report it to the army so that they had a better idea of what they were up against and what they were facing. So there's our famous Morane-Saulnier. And at the end of the war, they had that airplane on the German side, the Fokker D7. You can see that it looks more sturdy. It is. It has aluminum bars, or not aluminum pipes, basically inside the structure of the airplane. It was much more sturdy than this one, which is wood and fabric. It also went faster. I'll show you. Here they are, years that it came in. This shows you. Here we go. So the Morane-Saulnier came out just before the start of World War I. It went 68 miles an hour. You're going to say, well, that's not very fast. It isn't. You know, a car can do that. Even back then, a car could do that. And it could only go up to about 12,000 feet, and it had a 90-mile range, meaning it could go 45 miles out and 45 miles back. Look what happened by the end of the war. By 1918, 124 miles an hour, 21,000 feet, 184 miles. Now, again, it doesn't sound like much, but think about this. If you are in a car that can go 68 miles an hour, and that's its maximum, and somebody else is in a car that can go 124 miles an hour, what's going to happen? The guy that's faster is going to be able to go circles around you. You can't get away from him unless you dive into a cloud. So even though that doesn't seem like a lot, that's a huge difference. Also the height. That's like another 9,000 feet higher. He doesn't even know the guy's there. And he's looking down and, oh, there's that guy, and he's really slow, and I can go down and attack him. So that difference in just those 4 years is huge. And that's what was important about World War I, is that they were fighting, trying to take control of the air, and the only way they could do that is by introducing new technology, new tactics, new operations, and they were competing with each other because the guy that had this best airplane, the best pilots, and the best organization, they were going to dominate and have air superiority. Here it is summarized. Fly higher, faster, and longer while maneuvering and enduring, all better than the other guy. It's just that simple. And guess what? It's still the same thing today. Still the same thing. If we're fighting people like the Afghani militia or ISIS, they don't have an air force. They have none. So they just try to hide most of the time. But if we're up against the Chinese or the Russians, what they have as their aircraft is very important. And so we're having the advantage with the F-22 Raptor. That's huge. Okay, so there are 3 what they call T's of pursuit air superiority. And by the way, pursuit is what they called fighters in the First World War initially. Pursuit. So the things that you have to watch out for are technology, tactics, and then techniques. Those are the things everyone's trying to strive for. Trying to make a better airplane, better engine. They're trying to make better tactics, and they only know that by trying it. And then they have better techniques, and I'll explain as we get there. So the presentation is going to do as follows. We're going to talk about pursuit or fighter aircraft. We're going to look at the overview of the pre-war airplanes. We're going to create a timeline on the Western Front, which is the one most of us are familiar with and where the Americans fought. We're going to find out how that related, in other words, how the aircraft changes related to the battles on the Western Front. And then, of course, our 3 T's are going to come in to show what's happening. And, of course, the development of the pursuit plane, making it better and better all the time. And that's what's all changing air superiority. Okay, so what is air superiority? I gave you an overview, but this is the definition. So it originated obviously in World War I, the first air war, and everyone's been trying to keep it or control it ever since. World War II they had to do it, and it went back and forth. The Battle of Britain, the Germans had this huge battle trying to wrest control of the air from the British. They did this in every other front they could. And here's a statement. It calls for the dominance by all means of one enemy's air assets. So basically when Rommel's running around in North Africa in World War II, he needs control of the air because that means he gets the observation planes up there. It means that he can see what they're doing. They can't see what he's doing. And that's why it's so important every year since World War I. So the key dates, pre-war dates, 1903 and 1909. Does anybody know what 1903 is before I hit the button?
Wright brothers?
There you go. That is correct. The Wright brothers. So that's when the first manned controlled flight went more than just a couple of yards. And it actually was sustained for several hundred yards. That was huge. And it wasn't long after that, that in 1909, planes had developed to the point where, here's the Paris Air Show, which you can see it had balloons. They were still popular. But they also had a lot of aircraft. You can see them in the bottom on the floor. This was like hot stuff. This is like combined, auto show, air show, new technology. People were going crazy, and they wondered, what can we do with this new technology? So here's a very famous man, Louis Blériot. He flew across the English Channel. Looks very handsome here. Wait till you see him after he flies the Channel. There's a painting of him doing it, okay? It's very important, because England thought they were safe behind their wall of wooden fences, they called them, which were the British ships, okay? No, they couldn't be invaded. And here's a guy flying over the top of them and can basically reach England, which really frightened a lot of people in England because they never thought that could happen. And here he is after he flew the English Channel, okay? He's exhausted. Remember, these planes are not very fast, so, and also, except for some goggles, the wind is just blowing on him, and he's wrestling with that stick. One of the things that you can't see completely is that the engines on these are rotary engines. It means the whole engine spins. That also means that it wants to yank you that way all the time. So what are you doing? You're fighting it. So you're fighting the engine, you're trying to keep the plane up, and this is lasting you for a couple of hours. So when you're done, you look like that guy. Okay. He also started an organization called SPAD, which is something that you will see come up, very famous in World War I for French production. It's a company that produced, with his help, the first airplanes for World War I. So the pre-war airplanes, we're going to show you a good sample of them. We're going to show, and the colors are very important. Keep that in mind. French are going to be blue, British are going to be red, and Germans are going to be green in each one of these slides. So you can always tell which one, which technology achievement, which tactic, and so forth goes with which Air Force. So Blériot, we know him, very famous, yay. British. Sopwith, which was one of their famous aircraft manufacturing, called the Tabloid. And you can see that it has the little look like skis on the bottom. That's because the planes, when they came down, there were no runways like we think of them. They're just grass fields. So if the plane came in hard, it could tip. And if it tipped, then all of a sudden the airplane's nose went down, the propeller broke, and so forth. So those little ski pads there were to help it, prevent it from doing that. And then the Germans had something even more interesting. Spinning means web. So you can't see it from this angle. I'll show you in a second. Here we go. You might be, look at all the wires. I don't know if you can see all the wires. In fact, if we could turn down the lights just a little bit, it might be better for people to see. So to the Germans, it looked like a spider web. That's why they called it a web. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Anyway, so you can see that it's got all these wires holding up the wings and everything. It's more awkward. The Germans were way behind the curve at this point for pre-war stuff. The French had a great solid little airplane. The Sopwith Tabloid was great. And the Germans are trying to play catch-up. Back to the... Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, air superiority. Keep talking about it. All right, so the war lasted from 1914 until 1918. And so we're going to make this timeline that allows you to see what happens in terms of the technology and all the other things we talked about, the 3 T's. Okay? So the blue is the French. The French are going to dominate in the period you see. Then the green are Germans. That's when they dominate. The blue and red together are the French and the British, etc. And you can see that it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth because one side would get an edge in technology or tactics, and they would take over the whole front. And then the other side would try and develop a new plane or new tactics and come back and try and take control. So technology is going to be at the top, tactics and techniques together because they relate very closely, and then the actual battles on the ring. You may have heard of some of these. We just had a whole bunch of them this year, 100th anniversary, and then we're going to look at some of the airplanes. So the first thing we're going to look at is, I told you, the rotary engine, okay, has the cylinders out like this, and it spins. It just spins. So it actually spins the whole thing, including the propellers, okay? That's very important because there's no enclosed oil. They use castor oil. So where does all that oil go as it's keeping the pistons from like grinding into each other? It's being thrown back because the wind and everything is tossing it back on the pilot. One of the reasons he has those goggles is so he's not coated in his eyes and can't even see where he's going. And these guys would have all this oil throwing on them, and when they got down on the ground again, you take off the goggles and you could see their whole face was covered in oil. They had not yet developed an oil pan or a way to retrieve the oil in the air. So there's our Moran-Sangye L, which we all saw at the beginning. And of course, the first thing they had to do is, how do you shoot the enemy from an airplane? Initially, there were no guns on any of these planes, none. It's too heavy, there's no way to mount it, and the guys would go up there and shoot pistols at each other or rifles, which really doesn't work, you know. It's like, do you really want to take your hands off of the stick and try and shoot somebody? They like to talk about this, but believe me, there were very, very few aircraft that shot down any other aircraft by doing that. It's very hard to, when you're moving and they're moving. Okay, so Roland Garros, who's a French airman, came up with this idea that, you know what, I think I can mount a machine gun on the plane and I'll fire it forward. There's just one problem. The propeller gets in the way, and you don't want to shoot off your own propeller. So he came up with this idea, how do I do that without knocking it down? Okay, so you can see he's shooting it forward through the propeller, but how does he do it without breaking the propeller? So he came up with this thing, which is, you can see it, it's a steel wedge that's right in line with the machine gun, so as the bullets come forward, if the propeller is in the way, it hits the wedge and moves the bullet sideways out of the way, so he doesn't shoot off his propeller. And if the propeller is not there, just a little bit further, then the bullet would go through. Not very efficient, but it was the first time anybody could do that, and he actually shot down a bunch of aircraft using that system. So the British had a different idea. Okay, we don't want to fire through the propeller, so what do? We put the propeller on the back. We have a pusher. That's right, you can see it in the back there, and you see the guy in the front, it's like, woohoo, I can shoot anywhere I want, you know? And behind him is the pilot, okay? So the two of them work together, and the pusher is able to go and push the plane forward, but now he has unobstructed view forward, okay? So there's our famous Roland Garros. Let's go and see. Okay, so because he had this wonderful device, and the British also had theirs that could fire forward, and the Germans didn't have that, the French were able initially to take control of the air. If you're the only one with airplanes that can shoot machine guns, that's fantastic. There's one other thing that I have to say about firing forward. It's so much easier if all you have to do is point your airplane. If you have one that's like, it looks like, whoa, he could shoot anywhere. Yes, but remember what the old thing about if you have a rifle trying to shoot somebody in the air, and this is going this way, and the plane is going like this, and he's going like that, that doesn't work too well. So the French solution was the best one, because all I have to do is point my plane at the other plane and shoot at it and knock it down. Still was not easy to do, but it was a better system. So, enter Anthony Fokker. He's the famous one, who was actually Dutch, he's not German, and he had these ideas for development of airplanes, and he decided, you know what, I think the Germans will pay me to do this, which he was right, and he came up with a machine gun, very, very important, a machine gun on what he called the Eindecker 3, which you can see right there. Eindecker means single wing, and you can see the machine gun, right, firing forward. Why was it able to do that? There's the machine gun, right in the front, pointing forward. It's because he was able to make, basically, it's a lever on the engine that as the engine spun the propeller, the lever would be hit every time it hit a certain point. So he no longer was wasting bullets firing through. The bullets were stopped every time the propeller was in front of it. Okay? Very efficient. And again, all he had to do was aim it forward. This man, Max Immelmann, is one of the first guys to come up with, he says, well, now I've got this great aircraft, I've got this great platform, I'm going to come up with some ideas of tactics because there have never been any tactics with the airplanes. And he came up with, I know you'd be shocked to hear this, the Immelmann turn. Okay? You can see that the plane starts out going this way and ends up on its back, turns over, and goes the opposite direction. The reason this is really good is because if he's below or above somebody and they can't see him, all you have to do is do this loop, which, by the way, is very dangerous. Okay? There's no seatbelt. These guys are just sitting in these cockpits, okay? So this is pretty risky. So you come up over, spin back, so you're upright, and you're on the other guy's tail. That was huge. That was one of the first tactics that was done. And he also had a buddy, Oswald Bolka. He's really famous because Oswald came up with a whole bunch of what they called later are basically, well, we can look at this on the Fokker Scourge. Once that Eindecker, once that Fokker, the first single-winged plane came in, and the Immelmann turn came in, the Germans just took control because they had a tactic that the French weren't expecting. They had a weapon that could shoot straight forward just by pointing the plane, and this was huge. But Volca went one further. Oh, and this is the Champagne Artois area of France. Basically, it's where all the champagne was made, which didn't get made during World War I because they were fighting over it. So during that period, the Germans took control of the Western Front. There it is. They get control. And moving on. Okay. The next thing is wing alignment. So we saw there's one wing, but what if you got two wings? What's the best configuration? So they started to try and do different things. And what they came up with, the French came up with the Newport, which was a different brand. And you can see it's actually 1.5. You can see the full wing on top, and then it has this little half wing down below. Okay, there's good and bad things about that. It actually made it more maneuverable because the two wings gave it more lift. You can see that their solution was, if I can't fire through the propeller, what's the next best thing?
Above it.
Over the propeller. Okay, good news and bad news about that. How does a guy fire it? Notice that little hook down there, he's like shooting it like this. That's great. It's wonderful. You can shoot it. What happens when it runs out of ammunition? What happens when it jams? That's right. You stand on the seat and try. Yes, a guy did have that happen where the plane went upside down. He didn't fall to his death. He hung on with his toes while trying to kick the stick to go back and right the plane so that he could get back in the cockpit. So it wasn't very safe to do that. Okay. So here's more. You may have heard of the Battle of Verdun. That was the longest battle of World War I. It was almost 1 year long. That's how long they were slaughtering each other. So the Newport 11 was a big impact on that battle. It was slower than the Eindecker, but it was more maneuverable. So there was a trade-off there. And its major problems were, like I said, it had 1.5 wings, and the V-struts weren't that strong. Okay, you can see it on here. You can see that the little half wing is held by a V, the strut on the outside. And here's an example. What could happen? So Sergeant Andrew Campbell, standing there, landed his plane, but what is it missing? The bottom wing is gone. It wasn't very sturdy, so he was able to land the plane with only the top wing. Thank God he had that. But this shows you that they're experimenting with things, and the 1.5 wing did not work quite as well as they hoped. If you have maneuvers in the air that are too violent, the tension, the torque, and everything can rip that other little wing right off the plane, and it happened. Okay, so the Newport 11 comes in, and The Newport 17, an improved model, comes in. And then the British and the French have a Foster mount. Remember that gun sits on top? They figured out, we shouldn't have the guy standing on a seat while he's trying to do this. So why don't we improve it, okay? You'll see. Okay, so there's the gun on the top wing, but, okay, so this is what it was before. Not good, okay? It's not a good way to fly the plane. So he's shooting, and he also can't shoot by himself. He said there's a guy, the pilot in front, is trying to help him by guiding the plane around. So what they did is, okay, this is called the Foster mount. Now I can pull the gun down to me on a slide, and notice he's changing the ammo can, or getting rid of it by jam. So that was much safer. So they introduced that. Here it is again. Here's another view. It also allows him to shoot upwards, so he can go under a plane and shoot up into it. So the Foster mount and the Newport 11 and 17 were important because it allowed the French to take back control of the air. But one of the things they did, which is very important, is up to this point, all of these fighter aircraft are just sort of out there all on their own. Individuals going around trying to shoot down enemy planes. Whether you could find them or not, who knows, right? But they're all out there just circling around areas, and the air is a big space when you're trying to do that. So the French said, well, what if we gather all these planes together, and we take a squadron of like 12 aircraft, and we gather all those squadrons together, okay? What this did is it gave them basically a group, a pursuit group. And you can see they had 3 different squadrons. That was on each aircraft, and that allowed them to work together to keep a presence over the battlefield, because one squadron would go out there, and as their fuel gets low, another one goes out there, and then the other one goes out there. It allows them to keep a rotating number of aircraft out over the battlefield, their area, and this was a huge advantage to the French, because the Germans were still using the individual go out and see if you can find something. So this allowed them to do offensive operations. In other words, you could put your aircraft out there, your fighters, and keep them out there, and keep the pressure on the enemy, and take control of that area of the sky. Okay, so here's one of those aircraft. Guynemer was one of the top scoring aces with 53 victories during the entire war. And that's his aircraft. You can see he was one of those, he flew in one of the squadrons of that particular group. So, the British and the French improved their machine gun with the Foster mount. But then, the British added a little bit more powerful engine, which was really, really good for them, because the Sopwith 1.5 strutter. And you can see that it has 2 full wings. There's a machine gun that can fire through the propeller, and it's a more sturdy platform. This was really helpful to the British, and they were able to start, and the Sopwith Pup, which you'll see in a second, looks very familiar to another aircraft. The only difference between it and the Sopwith Camel, and the reason they called it a camel, is over the machine gun in the front was sort of like a fairing over the top of it. It looked like a hump. That's why they called it the Camel. So this plane had more maneuverably, a very sturdy frame, 2 full wings, and a machine gun that would fire through the propeller. All of this, you'll see that somewhere here, fast and maneuverable. And that's going to give the Verdun and the Battle of the Somme, both of which happened this year, earlier this year. It gave them the advantage, and the British and the French were able to take control of the sky from the Germans. So bye-bye, Fokker. Yes, sir?
When did they put the seatbelt in for them?
When?
When did they put a seatbelt?
When the pilots complain enough. Really, I mean, seriously, it's like
Not
these...
even in 1917 they hadn't put a seatbelt in yet?
I am sure that some of the pilots convinced their ground crew, the guy that fixed the airplanes and kept them running, somebody came up with the idea, maybe it's a good idea to have a strap that but do you remember back in the 50s and 60s when there was a big argument whether cars should have seatbelts? Mm-hmm. Remember one of the argument was, I want to be thrown clear of the car in an accident, right? It's like, I don't know why anyone thought that was a good idea, but part of that was, involved here with the thinking is that you'd be better thrown out of the airplane. It's like, okay. And also, remember, these are all armies, okay? Armies are very slow to make changes, okay? After usually a whole bunch of people get killed, then they decide maybe we should do it differently, all right? So, yes, amazingly, there were no parachutes either, by the way. Parachutes were known, okay, but the problem is the parachutes were very bulky, so you couldn't squeeze the guy in his parachute into the cockpit of these airplanes. Parachutes were used for those guys in those balloons who would hover over a battlefield. They'd look out there and then call in artillery. And when his balloon was getting shot down so he didn't burn to death, he would hop out with a parachute because he had enough space in the basket for him and the parachute. But there was not enough room in these airplanes. Yes?
Wasn't it also true that the Air Force generals thought it would make them more likely to break off a fight or jump out?
Yes.
It would sap their will to fight?
It's like, you better fight to the death because you can't get away, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, anyone who doesn't fly in combat would probably think that way. Okay? So somebody finally realized, as the death toll was increasing and the war got more and more slaughter, somebody decided maybe we shouldn't have so many of our pilots getting shot down and killed because there's like no way to get them back, So we need to keep these guys alive so they can fly again. But yes, absolutely, there were amazingly not forward-thinking people in control of these things. Remember that all these pilots, all these guys that are coming up with these ideas, you saw Anthony Falker was a very young man, right? Volka was only a lieutenant, Immelman was only a lieutenant, Garros was only a lieutenant. These guys are not going to tell the general how to run the Air Force, okay? So what happens is that some general who probably has never been in an airplane, right, comes up with this idea and says, this is the way we're going to do it, and the lieutenant's supposed to obey. It's real simple, right? The lieutenant does not tell the general tells the lieutenant. But after a while, they started getting and promoting these guys, these lieutenants, saying, we need people who understand aircraft, who understand air combat, who understand the technology. We need them to run these units, and them to liaison with the Army commanders. But that took time. Again, it wasn't instantaneous. Okay, so there's a British memorandum. This was actually published in 1920, and it was, however, the memorandum was from 1916. And you'll see what was going on. And I'm sure you can read it yourself. The Germans were able to do in the air the work carried out by our air forces. That we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. So we have to do something to prevent the Germans from getting the edge. Because if we don't, we lose superiority in the air. Again, coming back to air superiority. It's all about how do we dominate the battlefield. They now have gone back and forth a couple of times. They've now introduced new technology and tactics. They've introduced the idea of grouping the aircraft, the fighters together, to work together as a team. But the British are having so much trouble with the Germans. One of the things you have to understand is that the Germans were very happy just to sit there. They grabbed a big chunk of France, dug their trenches, made them very homey, okay? Some of them had running water, had electricity, because the Germans are quite content to sit there on French soil forever until the French said, okay, we'll negotiate. But the French and the British didn't want to do that. They didn't want to just sit there because they would not be able to win the war. So they had to attack. They had to go forward. And that included their air forces. So they would push across the trench lines into the German side, but there's two problems with that. One, you're now on their side of the battlefield, so if you get shot down, you're not coming back, even if you land successfully. And number two is that they did not want their trenches being so homey and so comfortable that their men got used to it. So the trenches the British and French were occupying were basically terrible. They were awful, okay? And the Germans are nice and homey, Christmas trees and all this other stuff. And it's like, no, we don't want our guys thinking that they're going to sit here for months. We're going to keep attacking. And that included the air power. But as they moved their airplanes across, And as the Germans were able to adjust on their side, this is why the British were worried, because they're just not taking control of the air, at least on that side of the battlefield. So a guy named Boom Trenchard, nickname, was a very famous aviation theorist and commander in World War I, and he also lived into World War II. So a lot of his ideas were formed in World War I. In fact, most of the ideas, and one of the things that World War I is good about, is that a lot of the guys that survived World War I, who fought in World War II, Eisenhower, Patton, Hitler, Churchill, all these guys fought in World War I. And the one thing they were universal about is, I'm not doing it that way again. World War II was not going to be like World War I because it was terrible. Every mistake in the world was made. Boom Trenchard was one of those guys who said, here's how we need to fix things. So he said, we need to use the air service, meaning the British, as an offensive weapon, not a defensive. In other words, the Germans are on their side of the field. They're quite happy to be on the defensive. Come get us. We have the advantage. And the British said, let's not do that. Let's not sit back, because we won't win by being defensive. The only way we're going to win this war is by being offensive. So how do you do that? Well, his idea was you keep sending the aircraft over constantly, one wave after another. Give the Germans no break, no way to rest, no way to match the kind of numbers that the French and British can get up there in the sky. Which was very similar, by the way, to the people on the ground. Big problem is, just like on the ground, it resulted in massive casualties because the guys could not charge across these battlefields with all the shell craters, with the barbed wire, with the pillboxes. Trenches were very, very tough to get through. So they thought, hey, we'll have a lot of artillery, except that the other side had a lot of artillery, and that did most of the killing in World War I. That's also unprecedented. Before this, there were cannon, there was artillery, but not in the quantity, not in the sizes, not in the numbers that they had in World War I. And so a battlefield, they just wait and sit there in their balloons or in their aircraft and watch the enemy come out of their trenches across basically what's called no man's land. There's a good reason why it was called that, is because no man can live in it, between the trenches. And so they'd come charging over, and they'd get slaughtered by machine guns, by artillery. They just had no way to break through. The same happened in the air, because if you keep throwing guys forward, just airplanes forward, you're going to lose more than the other guy unless you've got incredible pilots and incredible aircraft, which, again, it's not just talking about. I mean, you can get out there, and anyone here could get into a race car, Formula One, Grand Prix, whatever you want to do, and we're not going to beat the guys who are trained at this and have been doing it for years, okay? Because they know how to operate the car. The crew on the ground knows how to keep them running, give them the right fuel and everything else, and their radio contact, and coordinates them. So yes, we could all get into a car that goes 200 miles an hour, and none of us is going to win a race like a Grand Prix, okay? And that's what happened in World War I, is that the Germans had a system that allowed them to dominate their side of the battlefield. So Boom Trenchard, it's just not going to work. Okay, so here we go back to our timeline, okay? So we can see that, yay, the French and British have taken control in 1916, all right? But the Germans said, you know what, we think that's a great idea. Let's gather our fighter aircraft into what they called the Josta, okay? Which is where they put a whole bunch of their fighter aircraft together, and they dominated an area of the battlefield. So they were able to do the same thing that the French had done. Yes, sir?
What all were they attacking at this point? What were the targets? The air, ground?
Okay, so there are observation planes which are the most dangerous, because they're the ones looking at the other side, calling in artillery, and also coming back with photographic evidence. It's a really big thing that happened in World War I, is that it's the first time that photographs were taken from the air, and they could come back, and then photo evaluation techniques, first time it ever had been happened, where a guy would look at over a series of weeks, and he could tell, ooh, look at that, look what's moved in there, that's gone, and he could tell his generals what has moved in, what has moved out, and they could tell, and a lot of camouflage tried to disguise that, but a really good photography analyst could identify increase in artillery, increase in wagon traffic. That meant more supplies were coming in, so you could say, ooh, they're going to attack here, okay? So observation number one. You've all heard of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. He actually started as an observer in a two-seater aircraft. He was not a fighter pilot initially, and he knew how important these aircraft were. So when he became a fighter pilot and he was shooting these people down, 65% of the aircraft he shot down were observation aircraft, not other fighters. Fighters were not that critical. We think they are. Snoopy and the Red Baron, right? He's on a Sopwith Camel, his little doghouse. But they also were trying to do bombing missions. They were trying to do that. It wasn't as effective because they just couldn't carry enough bombs, okay? But they did all that stuff. They did bombing, reconnaissance, but we know the fighters, and those are the sexy things of World War I aviation, so everybody knows about them. But their only job was to deny access to our side of the battlefield of the enemy observation aircraft. We have to stop them from looking at things we don't want them to see. So you as a fighter pilot, the only thing you're supposed to do is shoot down these observation aircraft. But if you couldn't do that because you're too busy tangled up with their fighter aircraft, then the observation plane gets through and takes its pictures. That's the back and forth that's going on up in the sky. Okay, here's our friend Oswald Boelcke again. Why is he so important? Because he came up with, they call it dicta Boelcke, in other words, the rules of a fighter pilot, which amazingly are still used today, okay? Used in World War II, used in the Korean War, Vietnam, and still are important today, even with all our technology. And these are what they are. This is it. These 6 rules are what saves pilots and what they're all taught. Doesn't matter what country, doesn't matter what year. First, you attack in groups. You know, numbers count. Numbers make a difference. If I have what they call a wingman who's watching my tail, I can go in and attack, and I know that someone's not going to sneak up on me because my wingman is helping me. If you have 20 of your planes going in an attack and they only have 5, guess who's going to win? It's just that simple. Number 2, secure an advantage, okay? That means that hopefully he doesn't see you. If you're on his tail, it's very difficult to look all the way behind you. By the way, you know why all those pilots wearing the silk scarves? You probably see them with a scarf blowing in the wind. It's because they had it wrapped around their neck so their neck wouldn't get chafed by turning it on those khaki uniforms, or those wool uniforms. So the silk scarves were supposed to protect their necks. But even so, I can only look so far behind me. And so being behind another aircraft, that's why it's so important. So seek an advantage. Number 3, keep in formation. In other words, don't let your wingman get away from you. If you're out there all by yourself, you're dead. It's just that simple. If you don't have anybody that you can see on your side you can join up with, get out of there immediately. Okay, short range firing only. Why is that? Because if I have a rifle and I'm trying to shoot really far, I may or may not hit the target. If I have a rifle and I want to shoot this guy from here, I'm probably going to hit him, okay? It's just that simple. You want to get as close as you can before you pull that trigger, okay? Number 5, sun in the back, meaning it's behind me, because if I'm looking into the sun, I can't really see if there are enemy aircraft up there. And if it's behind me, I have even more of a disadvantage, because if the aircraft are coming out of the sun, I don't see them until it's too late. And then finally, keeping a line of retreat. As I said before, how am I going to get out of this mess? If it goes pear-shaped on me, how do I get out of here? You have to know where you are, where your aerodrome is, okay, where the enemy line is, so that you don't get in trouble. Always have a line of retreat. So, guess what happens? The rotary engine is almost dead. Not quite. But somebody finally figures out how to get a straight inline engine, which is what's in your car, most cars anyway, is an inline engine with the pistons either straight in or in a V-shaped, okay? 8 to 12 pistons driving the propeller. Now you no longer have that torque that's just trying to wrench the plane one way or another. So it first appeared in the Albatross. Notice how aerodynamic this plane is. The good news is it's aerodynamic, which means that it cuts wind drag, and so it can go faster. The inline engine means it's not going to have to be torqued. Notice the prop spinner on the front? Everything is nice and smooth. What's the bad news about this airplane? It takes a lot longer to build it, and a lot more expert personnel in the factories to make sure that these rounded sides and all of these factors are lined up, because if you don't have that, then it starts wobbling. And then the airflow is no longer even. So it took longer to make this aircraft, and some of the pilots didn't like it. Rick Tobin did not like his Albatross. Of course, that may be a personal thing. It's like everybody likes certain cars. Okay, so what happened then between 1916 and 1917 is that the British decided, remember Boom Trenchard? Yeah, we're just going to send people out there. The problem is that it takes time to learn how to fly an airplane. Then it takes time on how you're going to operate with other airplanes without running into them. Then it takes time to learn how to shoot accurately in that airplane. Okay? A lot of people go out there and all they can do is fly straight and level. Okay? They don't do loops, they don't do turns or all this other stuff. That happened in World War II. The Japanese pilots were given just enough hours in a kamikaze plane to fly straight and level toward the fleet and then try and hit a ship. They were easy pickings for pilots who knew how to do loops and all this sort of thing, barrel rolls, because the Americans could do basically tactics that enabled them to survive, and the Japanese, all they could do is sit there and go straight forward. So you want to give guys enough hours. That's why how many hours you're in the air is a huge difference. Well, the British, remember Trenchard said, we're just going to overwhelm them with numbers. That didn't work well because they were sending pilots into combat who had a couple of hours of solo time. And the Germans just shot them to pieces. In fact, there was a movie, it wasn't Dawn Patrol, I'm trying to remember, it was with Errol Flynn and David Niven about this. They were at a British aerodrome. It's a talking, not a silent movie, and it was done between the wars, and it was all about this stupid tactic or strategy that the British Air Force had of just sending their pilots out without giving them proper training. What does that mean? What does it actually mean in terms of battlefield results? It was called Bloody April. The Germans lost 66 planes during this time period and 74 pilots and observers. The British lost 245 planes and 319 pilots and observers. It was a one-way slaughter. It didn't work. Thank you, Boom Trenchard. So they decided they're not going to do that again. But of course, it's a little bit late for those guys. So this has come down during the Battle of Ra and the Ain, is known as Bloody April, April of 1917. And it was a disaster for the British in particular. The French didn't do that, the Germans didn't do that, but the British for some reason thought they could just send totally inexperienced people up in these airplanes, and it didn't work. In the movie, it's really, really interesting because David Niven and Errol Flynn get to the point where they don't even want to know the guys' names. They know they'll be dead the next day. Don't even want to know who they are. Don't care. They're just going to disappear somewhere. So it got really ruthless. So you can see the green explosion means the Germans have taken back control of the battlefield, or the air superiority. Yes?
Hi, isn't that when Manfred von Richthofen got most of his victories?
Yes, actually, it was during that time period he got a lot of his victories, and he was also killed. And he violated Bolka's whole thing. He went down after somebody to the almost to the ground, and he was shot down by some guy with a rifle. And they're saying it's an Aussie who basically shot him from the trenches.
So it wasn't Captain Rory Brown
No.
in his assault with Camel?
No. I mean, they
It was
wanted to
the-
say that, but they pretty much, they've gone and investigated it, and they basically, because they recovered his body. He has a bullet that came up from the ground into him. Okay? So it came up. It'd be very unlikely that this would. Also, they can, I think the round actually stayed in him, and they were able to see that there's a difference between a rifle round, long rifle round, and a machine gun. Okay. So what are you going to do if the other guy's got one gun? Woohoo! I'm going to have two. The bad news is it's more weight, okay? and you use up more ammunition. But what they found out is, depending on how you align the two different guns, you can have them all converge at a certain point, or you can make it spread so that they hit a wider area. So even when you're jerking around, you have a better chance to hit the other guy with something. Okay, so let's put two guns on these airplanes. So there's the Newport 24 through 28. Here it is, still with that half wing, but it has one firing through the propeller and one over the top. You can see that, there they are. And here's the Newport 28, and actually it has two. You can see that they both fire through the propeller, but notice that one's on the side and one's on top. Didn't really matter, once you can fire through the propeller because you have that lever that hits and stops the gun and then the propeller is there, you can do it that way. So the Newport 28 was also used by our air service. That's what our Air Force was called back then. The United States used that airplane, which, by the way, that's the insignia on that aircraft, is the United States. And the Newport 28, notice what it has finally? Yay! Almost a full wing down in the bottom, so that they have more stability and not going to have the plane's wing fall off. By the way, the hat and the ring, I think you can see that was very famous. It was the first pursuit group of the United States. It meant that Uncle Sam's hat is in the ring, so that's why they use that as the insignia. Okay? So, good engine. It could go to 22,000 feet. And then ailerons, I don't know if you can see it, but you see that line on the bottom wing? When they were first starting to maneuver, if you wanted to make a really hard left, you literally pulled on the wires of the wing so it would warp and bend so it caught the air so you could do a better turn. Well, you don't have to do that anymore if you had an aileron that just would up and down on the edges of the wing, okay? So they're figuring out, ooh, we can make a really much tighter turn if we have that kind of a flap on our wings. The bad news is that when they went into a really fast dive, now the top wing fabric pulled off, and the cylinders and valves weren't that good on this particular engine. It was replaced by the SPAD 13. Remember the SPAD I told you about at the beginning of the war? And the post-war, the United States bought 600 of them, and a lot of them were used in the movie called the Dawn Patrol. So if you see the movie, both sides are using basically this aircraft, the Newport 28. Okay, back to our timeline. You can see that's where the Newport 28 came in. And now, hooray, the famous, yes sir, yes.
Eddie Rickenbacker flew with the hat and ring, huh?
Yes he did, yes he did. That was
How many victories did he get? 28?
26 was his claim, but there's, not to say anything disparaging, but when you shoot down an aircraft, somebody has to verify that. Usually your wingman or somebody like that, and they come back and they tell your squadron commander, who interrogates the guy and has to confirm that kill. So it goes up the chain of command. So Rickenbacker was the squadron commander. So Rickenbacker tells Rickenbacker, woohoo, I shot down 10 aircraft today. I'm not saying he did that. I'm just saying that there was a possibility that some of those kills were not accounted for, okay? In fact, just to let you know that in every World War, almost every Air Force counted more planes shot down than the other side said they had shot down that day. Didn't matter who it was, okay? So the Germans did it, the British did it, the Americans did it, everybody. Part of it was legit. Remember, these things are going very fast, and some of the planes, the Germans were often counted because they used basically a cheaper type of air fuel, okay? And when they went into a certain dive, it smoked like crazy, okay? So you might think the plane has like been damaged or destroyed when it's just simply smoking, okay? So this happened a lot. Everybody did it. No one is innocent. Okay, so we have the Camel, we got the Newport 28, inline engines, we have two guns, and then we have the SPAD 13, which is, and you'll see this, and that is Eddie Rickenbacker's, well, it's not really his, that's a reproduction. But basically, you see the hat and the ring, number 1, and all painted up really colorful. You notice that all these airplanes are really bright and colorful and everything, right? You think that we're trying to hide. Well, you can't hide in the sky, okay? So why not show it off? The camouflage there is for when you're on the ground and there's an observation plane going over and it takes a black and white picture, okay? It may miss these airplanes. No, it never missed the airplane. I think it's just something else they wanted to do because they just look good. Okay, now that is Eddie Rickenbacker, and that is his airplane at the time, okay? Black and white photos. No color yet. And the SPAD 13 had all of the best technologies of the design at that point. It was aerodynamic, and it was really strong and sturdy, so you could do a lot of maneuvering, hard maneuvers in it, and it had a good engine, even though it was rotary. Okay, rotary engine. So Passchendaele was the big battle in 1917, which was a disaster for the British. Notice I keep on mentioning disaster after disaster. You know, the generals just did not learn. They kept doing the same thing over and over again. And in fact, somebody else who was in World War I, but not a soldier, was Albert Einstein. Okay? He was German, and he was in Germany, but he decided to leave when the Nazis came in, being Jewish, good idea. And he has a wonderful definition, which probably is correct in almost all cases in World War I. And his statement was that insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting a new result, okay, a different result. Didn't happen, did not happen. It's pretty awful. So, by the way, the nickname, this is a ground thing, not an air thing, but it's just as applicable to Boom, Trencher, and the others. So the Germans are watching the British do all these stupid attacks, and they kept doing it over and over again. And one of the German officers, this is maybe apocryphal, but I know a British soldier wrote this in his book after the war because he was so disgusted with his officers. And the saying was that the British soldiers were lions led by donkeys. Okay? He was disgusted. The British, I don't know why there was no revolution in Great Britain, but there wasn't. Okay, so the British and the French take back control of the air at the end of the year, which is why they thought they could pull off Passchendaele. Of course, it didn't work. All right, so on we go to the last. Well, remember those ailerons I told you about? Watch. There's the Fokker. That's the famous Red Baron airplane. Yeah, everybody likes it. It was just a fill-in aircraft. No one liked it in the German Air Force. It was terrible. It was slower. Yes.
It was actually based on the Sopwith design, the Sopwith triplane.
Yes.
And Anthony Fokker did his German version of it.
That's right. That's right. And it just was, it was okay. Remember, look, it went backwards. Now we got a rotary engine, right? It's slower. And those three wings, like, ooh, nice and maneuverable. Yes, but it also slows you down, okay? And there's that aileron on the edge of the wing, remember? You can turn on a dime. And the Josta tactics came in. Yes.
Manfred von Richthofen actually had 3 different planes that were his own DR-1s.
Yes, and they weren't all pure red. Some of them had partial red, but basically you used red a lot.
But if you were a famous pilot, you might have more than one plane.
Absolutely, because if you're a really good pilot, you are entitled to have more than one airplane, and the guys working on it made sure that at least one was always ready to go, because you might go back up immediately the same day. You know, take a drink, whatever. Yes?
Oh, and he never wanted their pictures taken before missions, because it was seen as the picture would steal your soul, and you'd be killed in that mission.
Pilots may not be the most superstitious people on the planet, but they come in pretty in the top 5, that's for sure.
Well, Manfred von Richthofen, someone snapped his photo the day he was shot down and killed. Someone snapped a photo of him with his dog standing next to his plane, and that was that mission. He never came back.
Yeah. Even though there are a lot of guys that had their photos taken and then came back, okay? He didn't that day, so that's where it's always better in retrospect when you're adding up all these things and say, oh my God, that was the thing that did it. So, okay. D7, remember that aircraft I told you about at the beginning? That came in, there it is. By the way, They didn't paint that. You see that it's called a lozenge pattern? The Germans are using basically all these little dots of different colors to try and make the plane less visible from the air while it's sitting on the ground. That was printed on fabric, so they just glued it onto the airplane, and it looked like that. Which, by the way, that's a model, and model builders love that. You know, it's one of the hardest things to do, and they just love doing that. By the way, notice that P7, it has that camouflage, but then the rest of the airplane's like, look at me, I'm bright white with a big red tail. So,
They called it Richthofen's Flying Circus.
Yes, because
of
there were
all
so
the bright colors.
yellows, whites, reds, all kinds of bright colors and insignia and everything, and so all these airplanes had come out. What the Josta tactics, one of the things that I should mention is, so the front is so big, even on the Western Front, is that you can't spread all your aircraft out. That's a bad idea, because then the enemy can overwhelm you in one area. So what they would do is they'd take like a Josta of 4 or 5 squadrons, like the Flying Circus, Richthofen's group, right? And then if they were getting in trouble down here, they'd all fly to these aerodromes and fly out of there to try and take the control of the air back. Then they'd run down here and try and overwhelm the enemy in that area. So they'd bounce around all over the place. So you could never tell whether there were airplanes in the area that you were going to be in. There was partly guesswork on the part of the enemy. And there's our famous ailerons. Okay? And, yes?
One more interesting interjection is Hermann Goering was Manfred von Richthofen's successor to Josta 11.
Yes, he actually shot down a bunch of aircraft and he wasn't fat. At least,
Yeah.
not in World War I.
And he wasn't
He was,
addicted
he was actually famous.
He wasn't addicted to morphine yet.
I think his injury in World War I
Oh,
got
that's
him
what,
addicted
that's
to
what
it.
spawned his addiction, yeah.
Exactly. You know, there are a lot of guys who, for various reasons, whether it was a physical injury, you know, or just the being their mind shattered. You know, we know about PTSD. We know about how things affect soldiers. Okay, they called it shell shock back then because they noticed these guys are like, and literally what's happening, even with PTSD, they know it's a physical thing. It's not just emotional. I'm so unhappy or scared to be in this situation. It's like their brains are getting thrown around in their skull. You've seen that concussions. How little it takes for a football player to have a concussion. It doesn't look like it's serious. There was a hockey player that went through a game, got squished up against the boards, didn't look like it was that bad. The next day he's vomiting, he's having problems. 6 months later he's fighting this concussion because the brain swells and all these other things happen. So shell shock, PTSD, all this stuff started in World War I, okay? Because the concussion from the explosions was enormous, all right? Before this, a cannonball would hit you, you're pretty much dead or, your arm blown off, okay? Some of them exploded, but they didn't hit that many people, ironically. A line of men, you might hit 1 or 2 of them, or the rest of it just goes under in the ground or above them, okay? But the shells that they had in World War I were so enormous. 150 millimeter, 200 millimeter, 400 millimeter, as big as me, a shell coming in with that much explosive power. What happens is the concussion. It sends out a wave, a shock wave, that basically just makes everyone near, within a certain radius, just go to mush. The insides. The guys were lying on the ground, looked like they were asleep, but their insides were total mush from this, okay?
Oh my gosh.
So, again, that was unprecedented, first time it happened. Okay, so you can see that, guess who's using steel now inside their aircraft? See it? In the D7. Why is that important? Because you could do really violent maneuvers now with the aircraft, and it wouldn't be torn apart from all these maneuvers. Okay. So the last battle the Germans launched, the last big offensive on the Western Front was called the Kaiserschlag, or the Kaiser's Battle, in 1918, and they were trying to overwhelm the French and the British before the Americans came in force, okay? They knew the Americans were there, that they were preparing and training, and they wanted to try and win the war before the Americans became a battlefield force. And so at the beginning of that year, the Germans took control of the air. They had lots of things in their favor. But then, once that failed to succeed, once the Germans failed to overwhelm the British and the French, although they destroyed an entire British army, The Fifth Army just disappeared. But they hung on, because the Germans, there were no tanks really that we think of them today. The British and the French had a lot of tanks, but they were very slow, and underpowered, and they couldn't break through like we think of tanks today. We see tanks and we think, oh wow, these are incredible. But they just did not have that kind of power to break through like today. And so, what's called the last 100 days by the British, the counterattack came in, and that means that the British and the French took command of the sky, along with the Americans now, who were involved in the war, and that was the end of it. The Germans were forced to accept terms, but here's the clever thing. When the United States got into World War I, we didn't really become allies of the British and the French. We were a separate combatant. And President Wilson sent 14 points to the Germans saying, if you accept these 14 points, then we'll accept not your surrender, but basically we'll stop the war. So the Germans are sitting there overwhelmed by the numbers now the Allies have against them. And so what do they say? We accept the 14 terms, 14 points, we accept. And Wilson said, okay. The French and the British were not happy about this. Basically, America had just made a separate peace with Germany, okay? And a lot of them wanted to keep pushing and take over Germany. They were still fighting in France. They wanted to cross the Rhine. They wanted to do what we did in World War II, which like every German city is smashed and that Germany would know it had lost. One of the big problems the Nazis posed for everyone in Germany was the fact that they were able to look around. We weren't beaten. Look at the cities. Look at the rivers. Look at everything we've got. There's nothing destroyed in Germany. We were stabbed in the back by cowardly politicians. Okay? So, that obviously is something else they'll fix in World War II. When you're beaten, you're going to feel it. So, here are the things that we went through, if you remember. First, Garros' firing through the propeller, just deflecting it. Then Fokker came up with his machine gun. Then the Foster mount helped that gun on the top wing. And then the machine gun was able to be pulled down and the ammunition replaced. Power to weight ratio was improved. The British in particular developed a really good power to weight ratio where the airplane's engine was able to give it more power than previous engines, which could not pull a plane as well. So the pusher and a puller, remember? The pusher pushes the plane forward, but the puller is much faster. Yes?
The rotary engines were designed to run full throttle, and how they controlled their speed, the revolution speed, was by rounding out the ignition system.
Yeah, they basically
They would have a
cut out
switch
the
that
cylinders
yeah.
so that the engine would slow down.
That's how they slowed the engine
Yeah, you
down, was
sit
by
there on the
shorting
throttle.
out, grounding the spark plugs.
Right. Imagine your car goes, 60 miles an hour, period. It's the only speed it will go, unless you kill the engine or a part of the engine so it will slow down. That's what they had to do in these airplanes. So
Otherwise, they ran full blast,
that's right.
full
They ran
throttle.
full. Okay, so we have now the inline engine comes in. We now add two guns, right? Ailerons to help the planes turn. Steel tubing to give it more sturdier construction. And then at the end of the war, the Allies said, you know what, we're just going to overwhelm the Germans. We're just going to make as many aircraft as we can, and we'll just crush them in numbers. Okay, not like the British by only having a few hours of training, but literally have hundreds and hundreds of airplanes. The French Air Force was the largest air force in the world at the end of the war. Not only did they have 3,000 aircraft, but they had supplied the Russians, they supplied us with aircraft, they supplied the Italians, so they really were the leading aviation country in the world by the end of the war. And all those are all the technology things that happened. Then, of course, we know tactics and techniques. The Fokker Scourge, when that plane was able to come in and fire right through the propeller. And they had the Immelmann turn. Now we're starting to get tactics that the pilots can use. We had I believe the Signal is swans. I think that they're, isn't that right? Yes. So the French are first to group their squadrons together and go on the offensive and go over the German lines and take it to the Germans. Then the Josta comes in, the Germans counter with their own. Bloody April, the British carry it too far and get a really bloody nose. The Just of Tactics come in, with Bolka helping on that. Here are the battles during that period. Those are the ones that are the most important that we're talking about. You can see how they line up with what either one side was trying to do the last 100 days, and here we go. And now we're going to show the aircraft. So you can see introducing better versions. And the Germans come in, French and British, and then the Germans again. So that's how the back and forth happened during the war. And I'll show you again who had control, air superiority. The French initially, the Germans, then the British and the French together, and the Germans take it back, and the French and British take it back, and then the Germans take it back, and then finally the French and British control it. Okay? So that is the overview, and we walked you all through that. And now there's a little slideshow. These are some of the pictures of the guys who were flying. Many of them died or were wounded. It was very glamorous. If you had like the wings on your sleeve or your uniform somewhere, apparently you were the heartthrob of all the rear area women. Because being a pilot, and oh yes, that's right, it's still sexy today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? Yes, it is. So these are the guys that did all this. There's Garros in his airplane. And notice that they have to dress really warmly, because once you get up to like 15,000 feet or above, it's freezing. So you have to wear really heavy clothing. It could be boiling on the ground. And the poppy is still the symbol. Yes, sir?
They would put whale lard on their face.
Yeah, keep it from freezing.
Yeah, to keep, and from being burned by the fumes and everything, the smoke doing
And
everything.
the oil
And
coming on.
freezing, or from frostbite. Protection from frostbite, they put whale lard on their face.
By the end of the war, they started having enclosed cockpits. That's what we have today with the bulletproof glass. But in World War II, they had completely enclosed. It started off, though, some of them were open cockpit airplanes. But that's what they had to fight in. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
What were the common food that fighter pilots would eat before they fly?
I don't know how many guys would eat because you have to go to the bathroom. So I don't think many of them ate just before they flew. You'd ask me, though, if they took drugs or something when they went up. The only drug they really had access to in big quantity was alcohol, and they were encouraged to take it. If they gave them the bravery to go in the airplanes. Of course, it might have impaired their abilities, but a lot of them did that. But they're officers also, which means that they ate better than the average guy, okay? Back on the aerodrome, they would have cooks, chefs to prepare their food. These guys lived pretty well. They also died in great numbers, too. It wasn't any safer in the air than a guy in the trenches, okay? Percentage of losses, wounded, mostly dead, because if you come down hard from the sky, usually in no parachutes, so if you can't land the plane or crash land it, you're basically coming in hard. Yes, sir?
Their life expectancy was 2 weeks, wasn't it?
During the Bloody April, it was even shorter than that. I think they averaged that out, but it was sometimes it was like a couple of weeks only because bad weather prevented them from flying every day. Remember, these planes couldn't fly in rain, okay, or snow and things like that. So you had to wait till the skies, you could have cloudy air, okay, but you could not have really high winds or things like that. Yes, go ahead.
No parachute. Is it mandatory for them to carry a pistol?
No, it wasn't. They did not have to, they weren't expected to fight their way out of someplace, Raoul Lufberry, who was an American, who was an expert in shooting down balloons, observation balloons, and he had a pistol, and he apparently got killed by Germans who approached him to capture him when he was shot down, and he fought it out with them with a pistol. That's what they said. Why anybody would, that's like bringing, a gun to or somebody else bringing a gun to a knife fight, okay? Having a rifle against a pistol is like, not going to work. Yes, sir?
Well, they would bring a pistol up so they can blow their brains out rather than burn alive. rather than burn to death.
There may be some
If
guys
their,
that would do
because
that,
their
but
planes would go up like
it
a,
was
like a
very,
matchstick.
very personal
And
choice, you know?
They figured that would be probably a quicker way to go.
There are a
out.
lot of paintings of guys just jumping out of their airplanes, which is, they're going to die, right? It's like, but, yes,
Well, Frank Booth also decided to shoot it out.
yes, okay.
But I have a question, were the fighters ever employed as bomber escort?
Some of them would, bomber escort, absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, they would be employed as ground attack aircraft, which is very dangerous because, you know, all the machine guns in the world are going to shoot back at you. But they would try and do that as well. And some of the fighters were designed to carry cameras because it was felt that they could get through faster and take these pictures on an automatic type basis. So yeah, they would be employed as more than just fighters. Yes, sir?
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the historical group that you're associated with.
Oh, okay. It was started back in the 1990s. It originally was called the Great War Society, and there was a second group in the United States called the Western Front Association, which focused, you know, at least in England, it focused just on the Western Front. It didn't even focus on the British Navy. It's like, you know, didn't focus on the Middle East, just Western Front, okay? But the American group of the Western Front was more broad-minded. I mean, we have people in this country, Russian, German descent, and everything else, so they were interested in different areas of the war, whether it was Italy or wherever. And so when I was asked to get involved with the Great War Society, I looked at these two groups and I said, why are there two groups? And why isn't anyone calling it World War I, which that's the most likely thing that people would recognize, rather than say Great War. Say, what's so great about war? What are you talking about, right? Or the Western Front of what? There's a Western Front, World War II. So I convinced them that they should merge the two groups together, so that's why it's the World War I Historical Association. And that became one group in 2011, and we hold an annual conference each year, and we publish a magazine. And I also belong to a group that's only aviation, called the League of World War I Aviation Historians. Okay, and I've got a copy of their magazine to give everybody. And it also has inside, there is our group's membership thing, or the other group's, okay, membership thing. So I'm going to hand these out, you can pass them around. Go ahead, take one and pass it back, please. But we just got done having a conference, our annual conference in Norfolk, Virginia, at the MacArthur Memorial, where General MacArthur and his wife are buried. MacArthur was in World War I, but he's more famous for his World War II exploits, and of course Korea, where he got fired by Truman. But we study all fronts, all different aspects of the war. The League studies just aviation, but everywhere. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention anything about the Russian Air Force. Didn't they have some,
Yes, they did. They had a pilot named Nesterov, okay? Before they had machine guns on these planes, Nesterov decided to attack an Austro-Hungarian observation plane by ramming it, okay? He thought he could take off its wing or damage it and force it down, because he knew how important what the information was they were gathering. Well, he crashed into it. It fell to the ground, and so did he. He was killed. Okay, and
didn't they also have a very big bomber?
yes, the Ilya Muromets. Okay, it was designed by a guy named Sikorsky. I'm sure everybody knows that name, because after the Russian Revolution, Sikorsky wasn't welcome in Russia anymore. So he went to the United States and built lots of helicopters. Okay, but in World War I, he built this giant 4-engine airplane. The biggest one that started, now there were other big ones that would be developed by the Germans and the British and everybody, but this one flew higher than the German fighters could get to. They had 7 people inside of it, which meant that there was an observer who could sit there and say, that looks like a good target, let's go bomb that. So it's like literally real-time destruction of a target, which just like drones that carry Hellfire missiles. You're sitting back there, you're looking at it, it's like, hey, those are bad guys in a car. Bang, okay? They could do that in the Ilya Muromets. There were 76 of those built, because the Russian industry was not big like it was in World War II. Just one of those planes was shot down. 2 others had accidents on landing, which a lot of these planes, you can probably tell, kind of fragile, and they had that, but only one plane, one Miramax, was shot down in World War I. So it was very successful. It's just that the Russians had terrible generals and ended up losing the war on the ground.
Another question. So
Yes.
you mentioned, I didn't know about the French having the biggest air force. Where was all their production centered? Was it one city or was it spread out?
No, it was spread out. It was spread out.
One in one city?
It wasn't like when, in World War II, when we built the factory didn't even exist. And all of a sudden they'd throw it up in like a few months, right? And then you'd see hundreds of B-24s or other planes being assembled by thousands of workers, 3 shifts, 24/7, just building these things. The French were able to get to that, okay? But the Germans and a lot of others had these like little workshops where, you know, so many people would get together and it was spread out more. The French had a little more centralization, but they also felt the urgency because their country had been invaded and was being occupied, so they wanted to do what they could to get the Germans out of it. Plus, they really quickly adopted the idea of having air power, which, you know, was enormous for helping their side. But again, their generals just could never use it effectively with the ground troops. Just, it was not coordinated. Yes?
Was there ever been an LGBT or female fighter pilot?
Not that they would say that. Again, there were, you know, the weird thing is a lot of people think the Germans are like these, you know, rigid Nazi-like people even in World War I. Do you know that they had brothels for men that were homosexuals in World War I? So they were very open-minded about somebody's sexual preference. Whereas the British, even though they had homosexuals serving, they didn't want anyone to know about that. And the French, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know whether they were as open-minded as the Germans were about that. But the Americans were, there's no soldier is allowed to visit a brothel, period, which is not going to happen. Even though Pershing had gotten gonorrhea in the Philippines, and he was the commander of the forces, okay? It's like none of these soldiers were allowed to have prostitutes, which of course was a disaster because in 1917, before we got into the battlefield, 30,000 Americans came down with basically sexually transmitted diseases, okay? And the British, in the last year, to show how they're falling apart, this is a very good question, by the way, because they were not doing well at the beginning of 1918. And you can tell how bad, I told you that one entire army went away. So how do you get out of the army and all the terrible things happening if your side is basically, it looks to you like that side's collapsing and you're not going to last long? Okay, if you desert, you'll be caught and shot, okay? If you try to fake a wound, you know, again, they can throw you in prison. But the one thing they did is that the only way they could treat venereal disease was put you in a hospital for 30 days until the symptoms went away. Okay, which one of the prostitutes has a venereal disease? Thank you very much. Okay, I'm out of the battlefield for 30 days. How do I know this? Because no one wrote this down. No one ever admitted this. But when you look at how many soldiers got venereal disease in the British Army, and they actually have records of this, just like everything else, it's in the medical records. So the first few years of the war was like less than 20,000 a year, then it went up to 30, and in 1918 they had 60,000 men with venereal disease, okay? I'm saying, how do these guys have time to visit these brothels when they're, you know, fighting the Germans and they're retreating, right? It's like, that's like I said, I really think that if you wanted to get out of combat and survive the war, they didn't know the long-term effects. They just knew that you'd have venereal disease for, you know, a period of 30 days before it went away because they didn't have penicillin. So these guys are basically trying to save their lives, and the only way they could do it without getting arrested or shot. Wow, it was a great question. Yeah, another one.
Board games? Any related board games that people?
Yeah, there's actually a board game called Bloody April, which is all about this air battle. You know, it's just like lots of British pilots go forward and a lot of them get killed. Okay, it's very interesting. But there's a couple of games that I think are even more fun than that. Okay, it has little airplanes that are like 1 to 144 scale. I don't know if any of you, but it's like about that big. Beautifully painted, already pre-painted, assembled, they're gorgeous. And the game is called Wings of Glory, okay? Go to a hobby shop or a game store and ask her, but go online. These planes are beautiful. It's a simple little game that you can play, and the object is try to shoot down the other guys. And there are other games that are air games that use similar format, use aircraft models, okay? But that's the one that you don't have to assemble the models yourself and don't have to paint them. They're all ready to go. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah.
Just something I wanted to bring up. Getting back to venereal disease, there's these various, I'm sure you've seen it, but I thought I'd bring it up over saying there's these various propaganda posters from the American Army World War I, which shows this very virtuous and heroic-looking GI,
Yes.
they would have called them that at the time. See, and it has under the caption, I'd rather catch a bullet than a dose.
Yes, yes. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what happened in 1918, okay? And in fact, I just gave a talk on sex and spies back in Norfolk because I was, it was a dinner talk after dinner. And, people are tired, they've had a long day, they just want to sit there and be entertained. And I thought, why not let's do something light and entertaining, okay? So I went through and I was looking up these records, which is how I happened to find out this thing about 1918 in the British Army. But the Americans were very puritanical, and a lot of it was political, and of course, in fact, I have an Australian friend, and I once asked him, I said, do you know why America got all the religious fanatics and you ended up with the prostitutes and the criminals? And he said, no. I said, you got to choose first. So, yes, sir.
Then the Japanese in World War II, when they planes covered with just cloth too, they didn't have.
Oh, no, they had aluminum.
I know, but they still had a lot of them with cloth, just a
At the
canvas.
very beginning of the war, many nations still had, or a combination of cloth
Yeah,
and stressed
because they said
aluminum.
that, yeah.
But no, they all went to aluminum. It didn't stop bullets, but it was much more stable
Yeah.
and sturdy.
But the first one, I can remember the one.
At the very beginning, yes.
So there was no, or little to no, air combat in the Eastern Front.
Oh, no. They were fighting there. It just wasn't first of all, it was over an area that was like 4 times the size of the Western Front. Okay, so you could fly for hours and hours and never see another aircraft. So it was very easy to go up and take pictures. Very easy in the East. But, in fact, Manfred von Richthofen, as I said, learned on the Eastern Front in an observation plane. But they didn't have enough aircraft, neither the Russians nor the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians, to totally dominate the Eastern Front. You could basically go up in any area you wanted to and take your pictures, okay? So, and like I said, the Ilya Muromets, giant Russian plane, could also go higher than the Germans, so there wasn't much air combat either. So it was a different type of air war in the East.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you.